Tea or chai, the most popular drink in the world after water. Since we uploaded the video about coffee, some people commented to make a video about the history of tea. You can find tea in every part of the world, but each culture drinks it their own way. Of course, the most amount of tea consumed is in Asia, because that's where it originated from. Assam in India, Sichuan and Yunnan in China. If we want to talk about how long humans have been drinking tea, we can't, because it's about thousands and thousands of years, kinda like beer. If you've seen our video about beer, it has been more than 13,000 years since humans have been drinking beer, so you really can't put a date on it. But China itself claims that they've been drinking tea for 5,500 years. But the first proof we have about drinking tea is about 2,500 years ago by Buddhists, and they were drinking both in India and China. This shows us that drinking tea was a Buddhist tradition. The tea they were drinking was nothing like today. It was completely different. They would basically dry out the tea leaves, compress them so much that they turn into a brick. And whenever they wanted some tea, they would break a piece of that brick and throw it in hot water and drink. I have never drank this type of tea, but the people that have say it's much more bitter than what we are used to. But you have to know that the ancient Buddhists didn't drink tea for enjoyment. They actually drank it for medicine, and they thought it was very good for you. Drinking tea continues like this until the Tang Dynasty takes power in China. This empire remained in China from 618 AD all the way to 907. Drinking chai or tea completely changed when this dynasty took over, because different innovations were used to drink this plant. They pretty much turned tea from a medicine that was very bitter into something that tasted great and you could enjoy it. At this time, it was mostly green tea, but they were also drinking black tea back then too. The Tang Dynasty had an idea to import this tea to the entire world, and they did just that using the Silk Road that went all the way through Persia and to the Mediterranean, where you can even reach Europe. And this was the first time they went eastwards, so they introduced tea to the Koreans and the Japanese. The Japanese loved tea so much that they had tea ceremonies, which was mostly done by the samurais. In samurai culture, it's very common to drink tea. And it slowly turned into the national drink of Japan, where everybody in Japan was drinking tea. Another interesting fact about tea is that in everywhere in the world, it has two different names. It's either chai in different accents or tea in different accents. Like Arabs say chai, the Russians say zai, the Persians and Indians say chai, English tea, French latte, Italians tè. The Chinese say cha, and this is where the name originated from. But the tea name also originated from China, but in the parts of Fujian. And since it was a place next to the ocean, it allowed this name to go everywhere in the world. And that is why a lot of places, especially Western countries, use the term tea. The term té went all the way to Europe, except to Portugal, because the Portuguese were the first ones to buy tea from the Chinese, and they got familiar with the name cha, and that is why they still call it cha. When you get to the 14th century, tea has been introduced everywhere, obviously except North and South America. The entire continent of Europe is familiar with it, but the Europeans do not like it because they don't know how to properly make it to make it enjoyable. They make it very bitter, so nobody likes it. Let's go to the year 1600, when Elizabeth I is the Queen of England, and they have landed in India for the very first time. They learned what tea is, and they get familiar with the way they drink it. They immediately think of a way to make money off this plant. They try to make the deal with the Indian government, and long story short, they tell them, whatever tea you produce, don't sell it to anyone else. Sell it to us and we'll buy all of it. So the Indians very gladly agreed to the white man. By doing this, the British had so much power in the world because they monopolized the tea that was coming out of India and selling it everywhere else. When this deal was made, a lot of tea would make its way to Europe, especially Britain itself. At this time, everyone in England is drinking coffee, but the government would add advertisement that tea is better for you, it tastes better, and of course, it's much cheaper than coffee now. What they did is they made the poorest British man drink tea all the way to the Queen herself. The British had a monopoly that was very powerful, but it still wasn't the biggest one because the Chinese had an even bigger monopoly. They had much more tea, and with the help of the Silk Road, they would sell much more tea around Asia and all the way to the Mediterranean. You have to know that in this time, China is the most powerful and richest country in the world. The British go to the Chinese and ask them, why do you work so hard? Every ounce of tea you make, sell it to us. The Chinese say, we don't need money, we want some stuff. The British ask, what type of stuff? They say silver. Of course, the British didn't have enough silver to give to the Chinese for the tea, so a deal was not made. The British weren't gonna give up that easily. They pulled out the drawing board and thought of a plan. In the 18th century, the British got familiar with a plant that would give off a substance called opium. Of course, they realized that this is a very addictive substance, and that is why they thought of an idea on how to use opium in China so they can get tea from them. They came up with an idea that we should make the Chinese people addicted to opium so they could accept opium over silver. At this time, the entire subcontinent of India is in British control, especially the Bengal area, which is very important for this story. When the British examined the best place to grow opium, Bengal is the best place. It's the best weather, and it's perfect. There's plenty of population as well. They steal all the land and enslave the entire population to work in poppy fields and produce opium. Over the years, more than 10 million Bengalis were starved to death because of working in these fields in these conditions. With the blood of the Bengali people, thousands of tons of opium are produced, and most of them are sent to China, somewhere that opium is very illegal. But the way they smuggled it, and with the help of it being free, made 1 out of 3 Chinese person be addicted to opium. The British were making a lot of money alongside this. You might say, I thought you were giving it for free to the Chinese. They were, but they were selling opium, which was needed everywhere in the world, for a lot of money. The British were basically trying to paralyze the Chinese government, economy, and people so they can monopolize the tea market in the world and become more powerful than them. So they were making plenty of money off opium around the world. By using Indian slave labor and producing something that the entire world needs, Britain turns to the richest empire in the world for the very first time, passing China. Of course, the Chinese emperor was furious when he realized what the British are doing to his country and his people, and he thought of a game plan. He announced that every ounce of opium that is found has to be taken, and he told his men, every single piece of opium you find, take it to the middle of the sea and dump it in the ocean. In a very short period of time, more than 1.2 million kilograms of opium was dumped into the ocean. When the British realize what is happening, they tell themselves the Chinese are declaring war on us. So the Opium War began. The Tang Dynasty was the richest and most powerful dynasty in the world at this time, except before the opium took over the population. Most of the men in the Chinese army were all addicted to opium, and you could say they were paralyzed, they couldn't do anything. And this is while the British army was all young, powerful, and ready to fight. It's amazing, the highest producing opium empire, not one of their soldiers is addicted to opium. Isn't that funny? This is when the British take over Hong Kong and stay there. They realize that it's a very strategic location in this area of the world, and they stay there. The Chinese don't have any power to take the area back, so the war stopped. Either way, the British take over Hong Kong and they stay here for about 50 years. Of course, the Chinese government always asks for Hong Kong back. And then eventually, in the year 1898, the British make a deal with the Chinese dynasty to let us rent out Hong Kong for 99 years. If you agree to this, we will leave after 99 years like it's yours. Since the Chinese didn't have any more power left, they were forced to agree on this deal. One of the reasons that the British Empire tend to the richest and most powerful empire is that they had the Indian subcontinent and they had an insane population in their hands which they enslaved. With the help of enslaved, they had a lot of tea, and since they had the strongest navy, they very easily took this tea everywhere in the world. It's very interesting because everywhere you look in history, at least in modern history, you see these guys around. What do you guys think? Coffee is the third most popular drink in the world. You might ask, how is it third? Because the entire world drinks coffee, right? But the most popular drink in the world, that's also the healthiest and most useful, is water. And in second place, we have tea. The reason tea is in the #1 spot is because a lot of Asian countries drink it. It's because most of the Asian countries drink it, and China and India is almost half the world's population, and they all drink tea, so that is why it's in the second spot. But let's get back to coffee. In this day and age, about 450 million cups of coffee is consumed by people per day. The country that uses the most coffee per capita is Finland, and it's 12 kilograms per capita in this country. That basically means the amount of coffee used by the Finnish people, you divide the weight by the population, you get 12 kilograms per person. But what's special about coffee that everybody wants to drink it? The history of coffee is not really clear. We really can't for sure say which country it came from. Some say coffee originated from Yemen. Some say no, it came from Ethiopia. Let's start off with Ethiopia and see what historians have to say about it. For the very first time, around 850 AD, it was written about coffee in this country. In the writing it says the people of Ethiopia took the coffee beans from the plant and put it in fire, and took it out the fire, turned it into powder and mixed it with water, and they wanted to experiment if they can actually consume this plant or not. After then, Ethiopians started using coffee in this way. But let's see what historians have to say about Yemen. The history books is pretty different from Yemen. A very long time ago, when Yemen was struggling with food and they couldn't find anything to eat, they would take coffee beans off a tree and eat it raw, something that's extremely bitter. This plant was plentiful in Yemen, but people were starving, and this created innovation with the coffee bean, and they were always trying different methods to make coffee work and make it taste better. The old writings always lead up to them, drying the coffee and mixing it with water. And it is because of these two writings that historians can't be sure that coffee came from Yemen or Ethiopia, and both of them get credit for where it originated from. They are sure about one thing though. The coffee plant originated from Ethiopia. There is a writing from the 14th century that the people of Yemen created the coffee drink and they drink it for energy, and after this, coffee is sent all over Africa. And most African countries used it. In the 17th century, the Dutch visit Africa and they get familiar with coffee. The first thing they did is that they took the plant to Sri Lanka and started farming it. They successfully do that, and for the very first time in the year 1711, they take coffee to Europe. It didn't take long for the Europeans to fall in love with coffee, and up next it was the French and Portuguese that went to Central America and South America to plant coffee. The French went to Central America, and Portugal went to modern-day Brazil, and they realized that the weather there is perfect for the coffee plant. This is the coffee map of the world, which is called the coffee belt as well. In the yellow spots, it's where coffee is the best. But a lot of people say the highest quality coffee comes from Central and South America. But you really can't say that because people have preferences and they like the Asian ones a little bit better. There are plenty of different types of coffee, but the most famous one that's used around the world is the Arabica. But right now, South America produces the most amount of coffee, and in between these countries, Brazil is number 1 and Colombia is number 2. But if you want to count it as worldwide, Brazil is number 1 and Vietnam is number 2. When you drink cheaper coffee in like a coffee shop, the coffee they serve is usually the Robusta, and the reason is that it's more plentiful when you plant it and it doesn't take as long as the Arabica, and that is why it's a little bit cheaper and it's used in different coffee stores. If you want to know different types of coffee, you kind of have to be an expert because they are different, but they're very similar at the same time. Even though coffee originated from Yemen and Ethiopia, but it's known as a Western drink. Except England, most Western countries only drink coffee, and obviously the Brits love their tea. Another interesting fact about coffee is that in the Middle Ages, coffee was known as the devil's drink, and it was illegal to use it. And if you've seen our video about the Holy Roman Empire, you know what they do if they catch you drinking the devil's drink. This drink remains as the devil's drink for hundreds of years, until the 17th century, when Pope Clement VIII becomes the Pope. It seems like he liked coffee because he changed his mind real quick and told them there was a mistake. The people complained to the church on why they said that. We thought this was the devil's drink. By hearing that, Pope gave an excuse on how to use it. You have to wash it before you use it. When you wash the coffee, you basically wash away the demons. The first coffee houses were opened up in the 16th century in the Ottoman Empire, and it was called the kahvehune, which is basically coffee house. Kahve comes from kafa, which is an Ethiopian word, and in English it's called coffee. After the Pope made coffee legal again, coffee houses started to open up in Europe as well. Something funny is that they wouldn't sell coffee to women in these coffee houses, and their excuse was that it's not good for women. It seems like the dudes didn't want the women to be around in the coffee houses. After this, coffee reaches maximum popularity in Europe, and around that time there were a lot of rumors about consuming coffee and how it's so good for you. Like they would say, whoever uses coffee doesn't get old. Anybody that's sick that drinks coffee will be healed immediately, and it was all fake news. Coffee is not a bad thing, but it doesn't heal you out of nowhere. When World War I begins, to give easy access to coffee for the soldiers, they made instant coffee for the very first time. Before then, you would have to ground the coffee beans yourself and consume it with water. But after that, it was all ready to go. They say it was the Japanese that invented instant coffee for their soldiers in World War I. When the entire West except England was consuming coffee, since the US was considered New England, they were also tea drinkers. As you know, back then, the US was under British rule. The Americans would live and had nothing to do with the Brits. But at the end of the 18th century, the British start taxing the Americans. The Americans get pissed off and start a revolution that's against taxing. One of these revolutions was called the Boston Tea Party. When British rule realizes that the Americans aren't listening to them, they put a sanction on them and doesn't send tea to them. The Americans were tea drinkers, so they were addicted, you could say, and they needed their tea. The British say, we won't send you tea until you pay your taxes. The Americans say, no, we don't even want your tea. When the British realized that it's getting sketchy, they decided to ship the tea anyways, and after a few months, it reaches Boston. On the 16th of December 1773, the people of Boston jump on the ship that's bringing the tea and dump 46 tons of tea into the sea. And after that, the Americans hated tea and started drinking coffee. In the end, let's see how good or bad coffee is for us. Just like tea, coffee has caffeine. And caffeine gives you energy boost. This is the main reason everybody uses coffee, and some are even addicted. Doctors say one of the best things coffee does for a human body is that it helps your blood sugar become lower, and it helps sugar be broken down. Another thing coffee is good for is that people that constantly drink this, compared to the ones that don't drink it at all, they have a 26% lower chance of getting colon cancer, and that's an impressive number. Statistics shows that 2/3 of the people that get Alzheimer's disease are women, and after some tests, they realized that the women that get Alzheimer's aren't the ones that drink coffee. Doctors say the caffeine that's found in coffee is the reason your brain has a less chance of developing Alzheimer's. Before we leave you guys, let me introduce you to the most expensive coffee. And it's made by this animal. The animal is called the Asian palm civet. This animal has to consume the Arabica coffee bean, and then the feces of this animal is the most expensive coffee in the entire world. The coffee is called Kopi Luwak, and the price of it is about $1,200 per kilogram. Would you guys drink this coffee? Please comment. Our story is extremely old, and it starts around 13,000 years ago, when the people of ancient Mesopotamia were using beer for the very first time. Beer is basically bread turned into liquid. They put grains in water and leave it to ferment. When you give it time, the sugar separates from the grains, and the yeast inside the water start feeding on the sugar. And when the yeast eats sugar, they create ethanol, which is basically alcohol. When the alcohol is produced, the beer is ready. With the same grain you make beer with, you could also make bread with it. And that is why some people call beer liquid bread with a hint of alcohol. A lot of historians believe the reason ancient people started farming wasn't because of bread, but because of beer. Because in terms of food, they would rather hunt their food and eat meat, not a bread that doesn't have more nutrition than meat. Beer is so ancient that most people believe that it came before bread, and that is why we can't 100% say which came first. But what we're sure of is that 13,000 years ago, ancient farmers were making beers with these grains. Organized farming in ancient times basically formed the first civilization. It didn't start off with civilization. When you get organized, you first form a community. Any ancient civilization you look at all starts with farming. A lot of farmers got together, created a village, then they created cities, Between them, they chose a leader, and the first civilizations were formed this way. Before there was organized farming, there were no civilizations either. As you already know, the first civilization in history started in Mesopotamia, between the two rivers of Tigris and Euphrates, and in Egypt next to the Nile River. Both places have a lot of water, great weather, and great soil for farming, the best foundation for a civilization. These were the things that ancient historians wrote about. But the oldest thing that was written about beers came from the Sumerians around 3000 BC, meaning around 5000 years ago. They wrote about beer and bread, and they also talked about consuming both at the same time. A few centuries after this, ancient Egyptians write about beer as well. It seems like the Egyptians loved beer way more than the Sumerians, because they wrote more about it. And another cool thing is, they have found beer in ancient tombs. In ancient Egyptian tombs, alongside a lot of valuable things, they also left beer for their dead. Producing and drinking beer continues for thousands of years, but nobody really knew what would happen to the beer so it would become alcoholic. They just knew they had to mix these materials and they'll get beer eventually. But when we get to the 19th century, Louis Pasteur, the scientist, realizes what happens that beer is made. In ancient times, they would think God is producing beer, and they would think the gods add alcohol to it. The first ancient parties with beer was performed by the Egyptians, a ceremony called Tech, and it basically means getting drunk, a day where everybody drinks beer. The Egyptians loved beer so much that they had their own goddess for it, the goddess of Ninkasi. You guys are most likely familiar with the Hammurabi Code. Well, one of the first rules written on here is that beer should be kept at a low price so everybody can buy it. So can you only produce beer with grains? In the Middle East, yes, but ancient Chinese civilization used rice to do this. They probably called it rice beer. But why doesn't beer head towards Europe? The only reason is that they hated it. Ancient Romans and Greeks hated beer, and the only acceptable drink rather than water was wine. The first Europeans that eventually used beer were the Celts, and you could consider them ancient Irish, but they were in Western Europe back then. And a few centuries after the Celts, the ancient Germania used to drink beer, and they really fell in love with this drink. They loved it so much that when Western Roman Empire collapsed and the Holy Roman Empire was created by the Germans, beer became the most popular drink in Europe. Our video about the Holy Roman Empire is on our channel if you would like to check it out. The Holy Roman Empire had weird rules. One of them was that no women can brew beer, and if they do, they're a witch. And that is why you would only find men brewing beer. The church would say if women brew beer, they're considered witch, and that is why no woman dared to make beer, because if you were a witch, you would be set on fire. When we get to the 15th century, the city of Hamburg is the biggest exporter of beer, and they had created one of the first beer factories in the world. The stats that's available says that the city of Hamburg used to export 30 million liters of beer per year. Middle Easterners and Europeans used grains to make beer. The Chinese use rice. But there was another ancient civilization that was on the other side of the world, the Inca Empire in South America. Did they also make beer? Yes, they had their own type of beer, corn beer. If you didn't know, corn originated from modern-day Mexico, and it was all over the Americas. Another interesting fact about the corn beer that the ancient Americans used to make was called chicha, and nowadays it still has the same name. So if you find corn beer, it's gonna be called chicha. Another interesting fact about the Inca Empire was that the corn beer or chicha was used as currency, and instead of exchanging money for work or goods, you would exchange chicha. Like if someone wanted some wheat, they would trade chicha for it, or if they would work or do something, they would be paid in chicha. One of the most advanced civilizations in the Americas were the Incas, and some historians believe the reason that they were so successful is that the people loved chicha, and that would motivate them to continue working so they can get the chicha they need. Just because of the chicha made the Incas have a strong economy and be more powerful than the other civilizations in North and South America. In the American Revolutionary War, the war that the Americans fought Britain for their independence, the American soldiers that fought would get 1 liter of beer per day, and that is why a lot of people will volunteer to fight just for that 1 liter of beer. We finally reached the year 1920, when US is 144 years old, and they realize that most of the population have turned into alcoholics, and that is why in the same year the government bans alcohol using and selling, called prohibition. After that, you couldn't find alcohol in any stores. If you wanted to buy it, you would have to buy it from gangsters and mafia groups, and it would be much more expensive. If the authorities caught you, you would go to jail as well. This rule stays for 13 years, and then eventually, the US government starts researching to see what's happening, and they realized that banning alcohol not only did it make the alcoholic numbers rise, it also made mafia groups and gangsters rich from it. You could say the use of alcohol had gone up rather than down, and that is why in the year 1933, they finally made alcohol legal again. They legalized alcohol once again, but they put some hefty rules behind it. Like for example, if a store or bar sells someone under 21 alcohol, they would be temporarily closed or permanently shut down. It's the same for cigarettes. Right now, beer is sold worldwide. Every year, 190 liters of beer is drunk around the world. And after water, tea, and coffee, beer is the most consumed drink in the world. But let's get to the main point. What will alcohol do to our bodies? Is it good for us or no? Doctors believe that a small amount of beer is good for your heart and arteries. It could lower your blood sugar. It also has different types of vitamin in beer. Vitamin A, vitamin B12, vitamin E, vitamin D, and vitamin K. But doctors say you shouldn't drink the alcohol for the vitamins that's inside it, because the amount of vitamin one bottle of beer will give you is not enough for you to continue drinking. And if you want to drink a lot of beer to get the maximum amount of vitamins, then you're just drinking too much beer. The first problem with drinking too much beer is becoming addicted to it. If someone drinks it every day, they're most likely going to create a habit called alcoholism. If you drink too much beer or any alcoholic drink, you will damage your liver. You have to know that it's the alcohol of the beer that does the damage. Wine and other hard alcohols will do the same damage, but the good thing about beer is that it has low alcohol in it, and it's better to drink it rather than hard alcohol like vodka. Another reason that beer is not that great is that it makes you fat because it has a lot of carbohydrates, and carbohydrates is found a lot in breads and rice. Carbohydrates makes you fat and gives you a belly, and that is why people that drink a lot of beer have a beer belly. This was basically the pros and cons of beer. Some people say that beer is really good for you and it's healthy, but it's not like that. Either way, if you choose to drink beer, please drink responsibly.